The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for attending our webinar on developing a security culture today. My name is Stephanie and I will be delivering this session today. I will introduce myself and explain my role in a bit more detail later, but first I'm going to go through some technical details. So you are all set to mute if you are attending during the presentation, but you can ask questions which will be addressed at the end by submitting them through the GoToWebinar user interface, and I will go through them at the end and make sure they're all answered. You may want a copy of the slide deck, which should be available in handouts, but it will also be distributed via email following this webinar. So I recognize that there will be participants with varying levels of involvement with both security and employee engagement. So I have aimed to make this pretty digestible for an audience with diverse backgrounds, essentially, aiming to present it through a kind of common sense approach that's quite pragmatic. So in this session, we'll focus on the need for long-term strategic approach for employee engagement with security-related subjects, as well as best practice and behavior change. So while we all recognize that technological and process-related controls should be really key areas when it comes to protecting your organization from security threats, this particular webinar focuses on the third element in the mix, which we call the human factor. So before we start, here's a brief overview of what we're going to look at today. The key objective overall is not so much about employee education or delivering really concrete knowledge about any specific standard or regulation like the GDPR, although we will briefly look at some of these and view them in the context of a security culture. But mainly it's about altering the mindset and behavior, as I mentioned, of your workforce to adapt to changing regulatory environments, new regulations, and really live and breathe a security culture as part of your organizational DNA. It's also about adopting a proactive rather than reactive approach. So that means that you shouldn't just achieve employee engagement with security-related subject matters when it's already too late and an incident has occurred. It's about being proactive and prevention, essentially, and that can only be achieved through an effective security culture. So obviously, while we should all adhere to things like security and privacy by design and structure our processes in a way to facilitate this, at the end of the day, the human factor is really key, and there's substantial research to show that employees will always be at the heart of it all. So it's also important to say before we start that this is not a one-size-fits-all solution or a magic formula of how to get your workforce on board, because every organization is unique and has different challenges and sort of unique obstacles to overcome when it comes to building a security culture. But hopefully I can offer some practical tips of where to start and also how IT governance can help. So firstly, we're going to briefly present IT governance as an organization and talk about some of the key areas we are active in. We are then going to look at why staff awareness matters, which is important if you want to get stakeholders engaged as well as your wider workforce. We're then going to look at assessing your culture. So obviously, if you want to achieve change and you want to make a difference and you want to engage your people in security-related subject matters and get them to work for you, then it is important to analyze where you're at currently in order to get to where you want to be. After that, we're going to look at common challenges and how to address them, which would be through generating a culture shift. Finally, we're going to talk about a little bit about monitoring progress and measuring the success of any campaign or intervention you have deployed. I will also leave you with some useful references and further reading if you're interested to learn more. And at the end, I will address any questions you have and present a brief summary of the presentation. So apologies if you have already seen this part in one of our other webinars, but we always start with a brief introduction for those who are newcomers about IT governance. So IT governance, in one phrase, is a kind of one-stop shop for governance, risk and compliance. We have over 15 years of experience in these fields. We are a growing organization with currently 250 employees. We are active in many different regions of the world. We have offices in Ireland as well as the UK. And we have many different subject matter experts ranging from the GDPR to PCI DSS, information security, different standards in IT security, cyber security, and offer different training solutions to a broad range of clients across many different sectors. A little bit about myself. My name is Stephanie. I'm a learning design and solutions consultant here at IT Governance, and I have international cross-sector experience myself. So I have worked with clients in many different sectors, ranging from financial to automotive and engineering, pharmaceutical, the public sector, to create effective awareness solutions and learning solutions across many different subject areas which IT governance operates in. So moving on to our first topic, why staff awareness matters. So there is a really clear correlation between levels of employee engagement and risk of breaches in areas like data protection or information security, meaning the more engaged your staff are, the more of a culture around security you build, the less likely you are to encounter incidents or breaches. And this is why getting your workforce on board is so important. So we can all see that the risk landscape is ever evolving and more sophisticated. So just as we would update our technology or any process-based defenses, it is also important to arm our people in a way with the right mindset and tools and behaviors to keep pace with today's changing landscape and changing threats. So on one hand, you have the kind of bare compliance requirement, and here's one example from ISO 27001 about awareness. And as you can see, it's very open and free to interpret. You know, persons doing work under the organization's control. It's a very standard phrasing, but in reality, it is up to individual organizations to implement this in a way that will really work for them, rather than just showing an audit trail to say everybody has done this. And it's a challenge in itself, really. So fostering a culture of security doesn't just satisfy this point, but goes far beyond that, and we will look at that in a second as well. And in this particular example, it doesn't, if you do foster an effective security awareness culture, it doesn't just aid conformance with this specific paragraph, but with many other aspects of the same standards. So things like leadership and commitment. So it really is an effective way of driving compliance. Here we have a similar phrase from the GDPR. So again, it's very kind of dry and basic, saying that it's the task of the data protection officer to raise awareness and be responsible for training. However, in reality, this is not the case, because in a practical way, everyone who deals with personal data is affected, and it needs to be clear to all employees throughout the organization. So it shouldn't be just the responsibility of the data protection officer. And finally, kind of to reinforce the importance of awareness and the security culture, in the ICO publication, Preparing for the GDPR, 12 Steps to Take Now, awareness is actually cited as the first step to take before anything else. And I think that this really emphasizes the importance of it all as the foundation, in a way, for everything. And that means that although you need effective technology and processes in place, it is really essential to address the human factor properly. It is common sense, but in my view, it is all too often overlooked and viewed as a mere tick box exercise. So in the rest of this webinar, we're going to look at how to overcome that perception and that tick box approach. So it's more than just compliance. We've looked at some compliance-related clauses about awareness and staff culture. However, in reality, there are more reasons why one should invest in building a culture of security, like learner fatigue, which is a common problem amongst corporate audiences with any compliance or security-related subject, meaning that there's a huge oversaturation, overload of information, and that audiences are simply tired of reading through standards or doing what is required of them in a mechanical way without meaning. Moreover, it provides a stronger defense against threats. It improves return on investment. It raises credibility and trust, and it empowers employees to make informed decisions. So there's this famous saying that the size of your security function should be as large as the organization itself. Again, reinforcing that everybody needs to actively manage security within the business in their everyday tasks. And finally, obviously, there are the consequences of non-compliance, which can be a big driver to invest in creating an effective security culture. Obviously, with things like the GDPR, we have seen increased fines, and that can be a really big motivator, especially for larger organizations, to reassess their current culture of security and to drive appropriate interventions. So moving on to assessing your culture, we have now seen why security culture matters and why you should invest in driving it. But before you deploy any interventions, or before you start reshaping and changing your organization, you should really take stock and carry out an analysis and assess your current culture. So This can consist of a learning needs analysis, a training needs analysis. It can involve different focus groups. And it's really about starting out on a journey. So it may be a slightly cheesy metaphor, but it really is a journey to compliance and a journey to your culture change. So before you set off, you would look at your sat nav, or you would look at where you're going, and look at where you're at and kind of shape a path of how to find your way there. And that is precisely what a learning needs analysis does. So identifying common drivers for resistance or gaps in understanding is the first step to gaining buy-in, or organization-wide buy-in. And this is something that should really not be skipped or overlooked for any reason. So with compliance-related issues, there can often be time pressure for people to roll something out very quickly. But it should by no means justify skipping this initial analysis bit in your culture change initiative. You can do this in a more rapid style if you don't have time, but you should never overlook it. So while you can use qualitative techniques, you can use quantitative techniques as well. You could have a focus group or interviews with stakeholders. You can also carry out company-wide surveys, which with today's technology are easy to launch and evaluate. And it is important that this initial stage is really as thorough as possible, so that you really get what you need from it. When you evaluate your outcomes of this stage, you can then use SMART objectives to help you keep on track with it. And you can really use it as the basis or as the blueprint for any interventions you decide to launch as a result. So we'll talk about typical challenges in a second, but to mention one common finding or one common outcome in our experience, and that would be the gap between knowledge and behavior, or knowledge and application regarding security and best practice. And this is mainly because most culture and awareness interventions focus on knowledge rather than behavior, and so do evaluation methods. So we will look at this in a bit more detail, but essentially research has found that while many people in most organizations have an appropriate knowledge about security-related subject matters, they don't translate it into behavior on their everyday job. So this leads us on to the common challenges, and leading on from the lack of transfer from knowledge to behavior, it's important to note that there's often an abundance of training, and end users will still fail to really internalize the necessary norms and behaviors required of them. So even though the level of perceived knowledge on security is high, the actual effectiveness of the program or intervention isn't what it should be. And ultimately, this is a question of security and mindset. And mindset is something very important, and to a compliance professional, it can feel difficult to measure, but there certainly are ways of measuring and evaluating mindset. And the most common obstacles tend to be that security is viewed as hindering productivity. So any kind of data protection or information security measures can seem like something that represent an obstacle to either productivity or innovation. It's also a subject matter that is perceived as dry and sometimes overwhelming, so it can seem overly abstract or complex for somebody who does not have a legal background or a security background. And again, this is a kind of issue of subjectivity. which people who develop training or awareness interventions face, because they tend to become overly familiar with the subject and they tend to view it as common sense, whereas the wider organization may not share that view. So that's an important point to address. And of course, there are many other misconceptions which we are all familiar with. For example, the famous, I don't deal with IT, it doesn't affect me. And people who say this often don't even realize that they do handle personal data or sensitive information, because they don't consider the wider context. Another typical misconception is that IT is responsible for it or HR is responsible for it. And the result is often resistance to change in mindset. So because people don't understand it, they don't want to or cannot feel positive about this. And it's a very kind of natural aversion to change. And again, this is why there is often a reactive rather than proactive approach to security in general, meaning that people in mindsets will only be mobilized or only change once an incident has occurred. So unless anything disruptive happens, people are not likely to change their mindsets regarding security. Another common challenge, which I've briefly touched on, are the discrepancies between quality and compliance and other areas like learning and development and internal communications. So it is important to recognize that creating an effective security culture is part of an organization's change management discipline as well, and that various roles within an organization should be involved. And I think that larger organizations understand the importance of getting change specialists involved. But in smaller organizations, quality or compliance professional is often left in charge of the entire training and the awareness cycle, which can be overwhelming for the individual and may not result in the best outcomes, really. And while they do bring the subject matter expertise and knowledge, they can often end up adopting a more prescriptive approach rather than driving commitment from people. Whereas on the other hand, you have learning and development and internal communications who bring a different view and a different set of expertise. And I believe it's very important, in my experience at least, to get these different parties and different stakeholders involved. So while there should be clear objectives and one project owner, it's very important to share knowledge and to share your expertise. Generating a culture shift. So now that we have looked at some of the common challenges, we're going to attempt to solve them and build a culture of security and therefore compliance. So as I just mentioned, there's often a lack of involvement from different parties and a lack of commitment from different parties. So it's very important to make it clear that security affects everyone. And I have listed here a few drivers if you do want to adopt a kind of top-down approach. It is really essential to get the C-suite and senior management to buy in and really lead by example when it comes to security. Then obviously you have your DPOs and information security officers and other specialists. You have your business process owners, which, although it is people focused, it will help to shape your security by design. You have HR and change management and internal communications, who are really valuable human assets for you to use in your campaign and in your initiatives, because they will help you to drive organization-wide buy-in. Once you have kind of involved all your stakeholders and have done your analysis and know what you're planning for your culture shift towards a culture of security, you can start to plan and further understand your audiences, align your strategy and your culture, make use of proven engagement techniques. Again, HR can help you with that. And be opportunistic, meaning that you shouldn't be afraid to leverage existing platforms, existing interventions, or anything which has proven to engage people in your organization in order to support your security culture strategy. So while we have talked about analysis, the audience itself is a really important aspect, the first point on here, because it will affect how you engage with them and how you sell security as a priority on your agenda to them, really. So depending on whether you have a very young workforce, a very international workforce, a remote workforce, you may choose to alter your approaches. Aligning your strategy and culture, I think this goes without saying and is very self-explanatory. It's important to tailor both your strategy to your culture with the audience considerations, and vice versa, your culture to your strategy, which is ultimately the idea of driving a security culture. Being opportunistic, we've talked about that, making use of proven engagement techniques. That's where your change managers and HR departments come in. Implementing a security awareness program. So this can be a very cost-effective, but also meaningful way of engaging with your employees when it comes to security. And while it is a program, it should by no means be something that is automated or that adopts one-size-fits-all approach. So in this diagram here, you can see a basic outline, which is based on really widely accepted models for awareness programs, not just in security, but in different fields. And it makes use of instructional design theories and really proven methods to get your messages across. So the quote on the left here is about offering a modern mix of different solutions and tools, meaning that you shouldn't use a single channel of communication, or you shouldn't use a single medium for trying to engage your workforce with security. You should offer solutions that are as broad as possible to reach as many different people as possible. If we go back to the structure, we have the why at the very top. So this is your motivation and your buy-in. This is very essential because it will set the tone and drive the rest of your program. It's not about delivering any specific information about security or telling people what to do at this stage or how to change their culture. It's more about getting the necessary motivation and personal investment. We've then got the what, where we move on to actually delivering knowledge and making people aware of the things involved in best security practice. It then moves on to how, which deals with encouraging transfer of knowledge and skills to the workplace. So this is our big gap, which we have talked about before, where we've got the dropout factor, where even though people are aware of best practice, they are aware of information, they do not apply it on a daily basis, and breaches still occur and incidents still occur as a result. Then finally, you have evaluation and it should never be finalized because it should be a sustainable ongoing thing. But once your core solutions have been deployed, you need to evaluate success, and there are many different ways which we will look at in a minute as well. And then finally we have reinforcement, which is really all too often neglected, and I cannot emphasize enough how much it matters, and it can save you time and money, because once the key messages are there, all it takes really is a little nudge for people to get back into the mindset. So we will go through each of these steps bit by bit. We will start with the why, so gaining organization-wide buy-in, or as they say, winning hearts and minds. You can see in the quote here, to attain the highest levels of engagement, it is important to generate personal investment and motivation for adopting best practice. So before you launch any kind of e-learning or any intervention you're thinking of deploying, it's important to get people to care about it, because otherwise they will view it as a tick box exercise, and they will approach it with a hostile mindset that will not drive adoption and transfer to the workplace. So here's one example of a typical intervention that can be used to gain employee buy-in. The great thing about this is that it's presented in a highly visual format, but it can still be launched and tracked from your learning management system, or IT governance also hosts these solutions. So in practice, this means that while it's an engaging solution, it will also provide you with a reliable audit trail, and it will satisfy auditors because you can track it. And again, that's one of the common challenges previously mentioned. There is the compliance and quality side, which can almost conflict with the human resources and engagement side sometimes because of compliance-related restrictions and requirements. So this is a really nice in-between kind of solution where you have really concise, impactful facts presented in this visual format. It's kind of immersive because people find themselves in this virtual classroom environment with this remote control. They can control the experience and go at their own pace. And regarding the content, you can use different strategies. So while there are the typical scare techniques or tactics, you can also focus on the benefits, which are all too often ignored. So here we have a statistic, for example, every 40 seconds a company is hit with ransomware. It makes people realize how easy and frequent these occurrences are, and makes them think about it and consider perhaps their own organization and the potential consequences of bad security practice. Another example are sort of newspaper clippings which can be adapted to your own sector and even your own organization. Some organizations tend to find these too abstract or not really relatable for employees. So again, there are many different ways in which this point can be translated. As long as you do address it at the start of your program, it's really up to each organization to identify their unique needs and initial culture, and IT governance can definitely help with that. Moving on to the next point, so this would be the second segment of the light bulb diagram you've seen, delivering knowledge, making it short and sweet. So for optimal knowledge retention, information needs to be clear, accessible, and easy to digest. This is really a no-brainer. It should be very obvious, but in security and compliance related subjects, it's very easy to get lost in a sea of information and different considerations. So it's important that whichever message your employees receive at the end in your culture change initiative is really boiled down to its essential, is really concise, and is presented perhaps through visualization techniques or other effective content presentation techniques that will make it really accessible to anyone in the organization, depending on the locations of your workforce. You may have retail staff, kind of shop floor employees, manufacturing staff. So in that case, you may choose to tailor your approaches to different learner profiles, to different user profiles, and tailor your language accordingly as well, or simply adopting a universal approach which you know will speak to everyone. So here's an example of content visualization from one of our e-learning courses. I think this is a very nice example, again, of the buy-in as well, because it makes people aware of the number of breaches and makes them consider their own organization in this context. Now, moving on to our sticky point, which was encouraging knowledge transfer to the workplace and what really matters. So as we have established, it is found again and again that people have the necessary level of knowledge, they just don't apply it and don't translate it in their everyday situational workplace context. So it is not enough to know what best practice involves, they need to apply it. And in order to achieve this, there are many different techniques. For example, you can use activities and scenarios, and these should be meaningful, encouraging deep reflection and transfer of acquired knowledge to the workplace. They should make learners active participants. So rather than just kind of passive readers or vessels to be filled with knowledge, they should challenge them to recall key information and apply it. They should prompt participants to identify risks and apply best practice in situations that could arise in real life on the job. So again, this is where it is beneficial to tailor any kind of solution you deploy to your specific organizational context. An example of this can be seen here. This is again one of our GDPR e-learning solutions. And users in this case have to identify who is the data processor, who's the data controller, who's the data subject, and so on. In a simple scenario, this prompts people to reflect and apply the regulation, in this case the GDPR, in their everyday context. And finally, monitoring progress and measuring success. So there are many different ways of evaluating your program and any change you have achieved. And it's really important to ensure that everyone has achieved this required level of knowledge and understanding in order to make sure the message is spread organization-wide and adopted. So there are different examples of how to do this. Here you can see one of our assessments. This is a very, very cost-effective way of doing it, which can also be tracked and monitored online through a learning management system. However, there are also more disruptive ways of doing it. So for example, you could launch a controlled phishing campaign where you purposely attack your own organizations or members within your own organizations and see how many breaches there are or how many individuals click on a corrupt link, for example. And that's a very concrete way of measuring how much the knowledge has been transferred and translated into their everyday work environment. So IT governance also offers that. And that can either be done at the end of a program, or it can be done at the beginning as well, either to leverage its momentum and get people talking, but also to serve as a point of comparison, really, for before and after. And finally, I wanted to talk about continuous reinforcement and ensuring that key messages stay alive. So once the program is finished, it is important to ensure that security remains at the forefront of individuals' minds. So again, it's very, as well as aversion to change, it is very natural to forget. And there are many ways to remind people in kind of short bursts of the importance of security. So one example would be a pledge which people sign at the end of an awareness program, and they can display that with key commitments which they kind of vow to maintain throughout the year or until the next intervention. You can also deploy a little learning nudge, which can be delivered in a digital format. One example would be gamification, so a little learning game where you perhaps personify the threat of a breach as a hacker, or you use creative metaphors, different settings to engage people and to remind them of the importance of security. Finally, I have a few useful references which I would like to share with you. So obviously, IT governance offers an abundance of information on our website. We have a blog which is regularly updated. Our subject matter experts are really superstars in answering any questions and providing consultancy services. There's the CIPD website, so that's the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. This is a UK-based institution, and they offer a lot of useful information about change management, about engaging with your workforce and driving your agenda throughout the organization. Then we've got the World Federation of People Management Associations, which is the international equivalent of the CIPD, also useful. And I have also included a couple of links to publications from PwC and HP Enterprise, which can be very useful for this purpose. Now we've reached the end and our conclusion, as well as your turn with Q&A. So the key takeaways from today's webinar are the importance of effective planning and diverse involvement, things like learning needs analyses, pre-assessments, any information you can gather about the current state of your security culture before addressing it with targeted interventions. Following that, there would be long-term engagement and motivation. So the idea of refreshing your campaign and keeping key messages alive, as well as generating personal investment from your employees. And finally, continual monitoring and refreshing. So the idea of evaluating it through controlled phishing campaigns or regular tests, and obviously providing a reliable audit trail as proof. Before we move on to questions, you can contact us via any of the channels stated below. We have LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. And IT governance is, even if you're not a client or future client, it's a very useful resource with really information on many different scenarios and case studies and things for you to look at. You can find that on our website, or you can call us and read our blog. And finally, let's look at some of the questions. Okay, what are the implications of a staff member not reporting something to DPO, the organization becoming aware and not reporting within 72 hours? Is this going to cause problems with ICO even if we do everything correctly from when the DPO is made aware? So this is, I recognize this is a very GDPR specific question, and you can contact one of our GDPR experts, and I'm sure they will be able to answer what to do in this specific GDPR related scenario. Next question. As a DPO, I'm finding it hard to generate a change in culture with the sales director and the sales team who relies on doing things with personal data that is simply not allowed under the GDPR. How do you go about converting the mindset if they are already trying to find loopholes and workarounds? Ultimately, I feel they will break the rules and keep it hush-hush, which is the opposite of what we want to achieve. Okay, so obviously with sales and marketing, it's a particularly heavy question with the GDPR. I think that once the GDPR applies, there will be breaches and there will be consequences for certain organizations. It is only a matter of time. And when that occurs, you can really use that as a case study for your own sales department and your own people to look at, to see in very concrete terms what can happen to an organization and its employees as a result of a breach, and how it is simply not logical and not worth any potential gain which your sales department would have from it. But also it's quite an interesting question. So if you want to get in touch with IT governance after this, I'm happy to look at this in more detail and come up with concrete solutions to help you on that specific point. Next question. A lot of research has been done about the gamification of information security training. Would you recommend this as an approach, and what examples of this can you share? Also, are there any other novel ways to deliver training other than the traditional classroom e-learning, etc.? Yes, I'm very happy to share some examples of gamification. If I just end this show and show you some examples, Hazel, we have got an example of this gamified information security training, and it addresses a number of different challenges. So what we have done is we have personified the information security threat as a hacker, and this is particularly effective because often people view an information security threat as something that's very abstract and unreal in a way. So by personifying it, we've made it something that's very real and close and threatening to them, which should change the perception of people. Next, users are prompted to answer questions in order to keep this hacker out and protect their organization. So by answering the questions correctly, they can trigger these bricks to fall and in a Tetris-like manner and physically build a wall to keep out the threat. And this means that it is made very clear that appropriate knowledge and being able to answer these questions will protect your organizations from threats. So I think this is one effective example of information security gamification, but there is really a sea of literature out there, and there are so many examples, and IT governance also engage with our clients to develop these types of solutions. Apart from gamification and other traditional classroom and e-learning solutions, I think when you talk to your internal communications department, they will find many different ways of engaging with people and driving interest in information security. You can leverage any existing communication channels, like your Microsoft suite, things like Yammer, things like Teams, and build a whole community and build interest around information security, perhaps even in ways that mimic social media or that mimic new media, presented in a format which people are more used to than traditional e-learning formats. Next question. How frequently would you change your security strategy whilst developing a security culture or trying to improve your security culture? By security strategy, I don't know whether you mean security awareness strategy or security strategy, because they are essentially two different things which have to be aligned with each other. As I mentioned, you should by no means adopt an automated sort of mechanic approach and just keep pushing things out. Ideally, what you should try to establish is a pull methodology whereby people engage with information security on demand almost. So while the contents can be off the shelf, and IT governance offers really high quality off the shelf contents, it's more about the communications around it, which should be updated and should be renewed regularly. And again, the frequency depends on your organization, your audience, types of people and learners. And again, I'm happy to discuss any specific situation in more detail if you contact us. This is a very useful and good webinar. Will you be able to share the recording? I think this has already been answered. Yes, recordings are shared. Next question. Do you think that security breach examples that could have an impact on employees' personal lives, for example, banking, are more beneficial than how it affects the organization in terms of driving adoption? This is a very good question, and I think that you can really use a mix, but I definitely think you shouldn't neglect the personal factor. So it's very beneficial to include that, and in IT governance's information security interventions always tend to adopt a very kind of pragmatic, person-focused approach by selling the benefits to the individual and making them aware of how it applies to their personal as well as their professional lives. Thank you for the presentation, useful takeaways on engagement. The hardest task of all, what if you don't have senior management buy-in? Gosh, this is an interesting question. Senior management buy-in. I don't know how large your organization is or what your specific context is, but again, I think that the consequences of breaches, the consequences of non-compliance and a lack of engagement should really act as a key driver for engaging stakeholders and senior management. And if you can make a very logical cost-benefit case, the way in which it could drive customer engagement, it could increase the credibility of your organization, then that should definitely help you, as well as obviously, as mentioned before, the consequences of non-compliance and the fact that with the GDPR especially, there will be really striking examples of that. How would you deal with non-conformance employees, so non-conformant employees? So again, this is a very, very difficult question. Obviously, you should have an automatic sort of disciplinary process, and they should undergo more training, but at the same time, depending on the severeness of the problem, it shouldn't be a punishment, or it shouldn't be making an example of someone. Again, I'm happy to discuss any specific example in more detail. Okay, next question. Aside from phishing campaigns, are there other examples that you could provide for job-relevant engagement? So again, this depends very much on the sector which you operate in, and even on people's individual roles within an organization. For example, I have worked with many retail audiences who take people's email addresses and names and phone numbers on a very business to customer kind of basis. And for those people, because they are often remote, you can have sample scenarios which are deployed to a mobile phone. So it's like a face-to-face interaction with a customer, where they have to make sure they follow a certain process to be compliant and to consider security, but also to show the customer that they care about security. Next question, do you have a list of consequences that occur if different types of breaches are conducted, or different types of breaches occur? So again, this is something which you could find on the IT governance blog or website. We do, in some of our training interventions, we do list the concrete consequences of non-compliance and the different levels as well. So we do that in some of our face-to-face training as well as online training. Again, if you get in touch after this webinar with IT governance, then I'm sure somebody can help you. Absolutely love the webinar. Do you have a security checklist addressed to EDUs or academic institutions? Again, we have sector-specific consultants, including education, who can help you out with this type of question. If you would like to give us a call after this webinar, we can put you in touch with an expert or a specific account manager for that sector, who will be able to give you more detailed information on that. What sort of strategies can be employed in organizations that employ agile delivery approaches? Oh, this is a good one. And where security is sometimes pejoratively and dismissively regarded as a blocker. I fully empathize with both sides of this argument, because on one hand, I work on a production level as well, and I approve of agile and really anything that simplifies processes. But on the other hand, I also work in security, so I fully understand that side. Again, this is a very tricky one, and you could approach it in a similar way to the sales resistance scenario, where once breaches occur in your sector or a similar context to your organization, you really take that as an example and a case study and hold it up to people and make them realize the potential consequences. And you can do this in creative ways through different visual engagement methods as well. And I think we have reached the end, so thank you very much for attending. As mentioned, you can get in touch with IT governance or myself with any further questions.